Imagine this. You wake up inside a Roman town in Britain. The roads are still there. The baths still smoke in the cold morning air. The tax collectors, the magistrates, the market stalls, the banners of empire, all of it still looks Roman. But the legions are gone. Gone. No marching columns on the roads. No eagle standards on the horizon. No armored wall between you and the enemies gathering beyond the frontier. In one brutal moment, the strongest empire on earth has silently decided that your life, your city, and your future are no longer worth defending. That is not fiction. That is Britain in 410 AD. After nearly 400 years of Roman rule, Rome abandoned the island. Not with a grand final battle. Not with a heroic last stand. With something colder. A refusal. A message. A withdrawal so devastating that what followed looked less like decline and more like the death of a world. And the terrifying part is this: Britain was not lost in a single day. It was stripped away piece by piece, until the people left behind finally realized they had been sacrificed. And what happened next was chaos. Before we dive into this story, make sure you subscribe to Medieval Archive, because here, every battle is more than blood and steel. If you love epic wars and the brutal turning points that shaped the medieval world, stay with us. We need to understand what Rome had built there, because only then do you grasp how shocking this abandonment really was. When Emperor Claudius invaded Britain in 43 AD, he did not send explorers. He sent power. Around 40,000 soldiers crossed the sea to bring the island into the Roman world. The conquest was violent, relentless, and costly, but it worked. Over time, Britannia became more than a conquered land. It became a Roman province shaped by Roman law, Roman money, Roman roads, and Roman military discipline. Across the island, roads cut through forests and hills like lines of control carved into the earth itself. Cities rose with temples, forums, baths, villas, and workshops. Londinium became a major urban center. Hadrian's Wall stood in the north like a stone threat aimed at every enemy beyond it. For the local elite especially, Rome did not just mean occupation. It meant order, protection, prestige, civilization. And that is exactly why what came later felt so catastrophic. Because when Rome left Britain, it did not merely withdraw troops. It ripped away the entire structure holding the province together. Roman Britain was not some half-dead frontier limping along in misery. It was deeply tied into the imperial machine. Villas displayed mosaic floors. Glass windows caught the light. Wealth moved through markets. Latin spread through administration and status. Roman customs blended with local Celtic traditions until a new provincial identity emerged. Many Britons did not see Rome as a distant foreign tyrant anymore. They saw Rome as the system that made life stable, predictable, and safe. Now think about what that means. If the empire protecting your roads, your trade, your towns, and your border suddenly begins to crack, everything cracks with it. A civilization like Rome does not collapse in one dramatic explosion. First, soldiers are reassigned. Then messages arrive later. Then supplies slow down. Then confidence dies. And once confidence dies, fear moves in. Britain was about to learn that the real strength of Rome was never just its armies. It was the belief that Rome would always be there. The moment that belief broke, the island stood on the edge of the abyss. To understand why Britain was abandoned, we have to leave the island and look at the empire itself, because by the 3rd century, Rome was being torn apart from every direction. In roughly 50 years, more than 50 emperors rose and fell. Many were assassinated. Others died in battle. Power changed hands so fast that the throne began to look less like a seat of rule and more like a death sentence. Civil war drained the empire from within, while foreign enemies battered it from without. And then the economy started rotting. Emperors debased the currency, reducing the silver in Roman coins to stretch resources further. In practice, it was a disaster. Prices rose. Trust in money collapsed. Stability vanished. At the same time, pressure mounted along the borders. Goths, Vandals, Franks, Alemanni, Saxons. Everywhere Rome looked, enemies were testing its defenses. This was no longer the unstoppable empire of old. This was a giant bleeding from 100 wounds. And when an empire is fighting for survival, distant provinces stop looking like trophies. They start looking like burdens. Britain was now in deadly danger, not because it had failed Rome, but because Rome was beginning to fail itself. Here is the brutal strategic truth. Britannia sat at the far edge of the Roman world. It was across the sea, expensive to supply, expensive to defend, and constantly exposed to raids. Holding it required men, ships, money, and attention, exactly the things the empire was running out of. When Italy was under threat, when Gaul was burning, when the Rhine and Danube frontiers looked ready to burst open, Britain started to look less like an essential possession and more like a luxury Rome could no longer afford. That is the cruel mathematics of empire. You do not keep every province because you love it. You keep the ones you can still save. And Britain, for all its value, was becoming harder and harder to justify. The disaster did not arrive in one clean decision. It came in stages. One withdrawal. One emergency. One redeployment after another. Each move made sense from the center of imperial power. But from Britain's point of view, each one was another brick ripped from the wall. And then came the first major blow, a single act that changed the island's future forever. In 383, the Roman general Magnus Maximus was proclaimed emperor by troops in Britain. This was not unusual in the late empire. Ambitious commanders were constantly being raised by armies hungry for reward, power, or survival. But what Maximus did next was disastrous for the island. He took a substantial portion of Britain's military strength across the Channel to fight for the imperial throne. In that moment, Britain's soldiers were no longer defending Britain. They were being used in Rome's endless internal struggle for power. Maximus would ultimately be defeated and executed. But the men he took did not come back. That detail matters. Britain was not simply attacked from outside. It was hollowed out from within by the empire it had trusted for generations. Suddenly, the island's defenses were thinner, weaker, and slower to respond. The enemies beyond Rome's borders noticed. Of course they did. Predators always notice weakness. And once that weakness became visible, the attacks began to gather from every direction. What followed was not yet the final collapse, but the countdown had already started. With fewer Roman troops guarding the province, pressure increased fast. From the north came the Picts, hard and relentless, pushing down toward the Romanized zones. From the west came Irish raiders, striking exposed coasts and vulnerable communities. And from the east came Saxon sea raiders, men who did not need to conquer the whole island at first. They only needed to burn, loot, kill, and leave, returning again and again until fear itself became a weapon. Britain was no longer a calm imperial province. It was becoming a battlefield frontier. Rome did attempt repairs. Reinforcements were sent at times. Defensive systems were patched. But the empire was trying to plug a breach in a collapsing fortress while the rest of its walls were already shaking. The problem was no longer local. It was systemic. Britain needed strong, permanent military backing. Rome could offer only temporary fixes. And if you have ever seen a battle line start to bend, you know what happens next. Once enough pressure builds, bending turns into breaking. Then came another withdrawal, and this one cut even deeper. In 401, the powerful general Stilicho pulled more troops out of Britain to defend Italy against Alaric and the Visigoths. Think about what that means. The empire was now stripping one frontier to save another. Britain was being weakened not because it was peaceful, but because the core of the empire was under direct threat. The center was panicking. And when the center panics, the edges are sacrificed first. Then came the catastrophe that pushed everything closer to the edge. In 406, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed the frozen Rhine and flooded into Gaul. This was not a raid. It was a strategic nightmare. Gaul was the land bridge connecting Britain to the rest of the Western Empire. Once Gaul was thrown into chaos, Britain was no longer just vulnerable. It was isolated. Trade routes were shattered. Communications became uncertain. Reinforcements became unlikely. The island was now staring across the sea at a collapsing continent, waiting for help that was growing less possible by the month. And then desperation turned Britain inward. As panic spread, the remaining troops in Britain began doing what desperate Roman soldiers often did in times of collapse. They made emperors. First Marcus, then Gratian, then Constantine III. One after another. Usurpers were raised because confidence in the existing system was gone. The island no longer trusted that legitimate imperial authority would protect it. So the troops tried to create their own answer, their own savior, their own strongman. That alone tells you how severe the crisis had become. But Constantine III made the fatal move. In 407, he crossed into Gaul, taking with him the last major Roman field forces from Britain. Once again, the island's defenders were taken away for a struggle centered somewhere else. Once again, they never returned. Let that sink in. Rome did not lose Britain in one dramatic siege. It drained Britain of soldiers again and again until there was almost nothing left. By now, Roman Britain was standing nearly naked before its enemies. The towns could still call themselves Roman. The people could still remember Roman order. But the sword arm of empire was gone. The cities of Britain sent desperate appeals for help, but Rome itself was descending into humiliation. In 410, Alaric's Visigoths sacked Rome. The unthinkable had happened. The city that had dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries was violated by a foreign enemy. The psychological shock of that event cannot be overstated. If Rome could not protect Rome, who exactly was going to save Britain? The answer was brutal: no one. It was in that atmosphere of imperial breakdown that the British cities appealed to Emperor Honorius, who ruled from Ravenna. According to the historian Zosimus, Honorius replied that the cities of Britain should see to their own defense. Just like that, the bond was broken. No rescue fleet, no returning legions, no speech about honor, duty, or imperial loyalty. Just a cold instruction to survive alone. 400 years of Roman rule ended not with trumpets, but with abandonment. And for the people left behind, that may have been even worse than a battlefield defeat. Because, at least in battle, someone still comes to fight for you. After Rome's withdrawal, the machinery of Roman Britain began collapsing with terrifying speed. Cities that depended on organized supply and trade started to shrink and empty. Coin circulation faltered. Administration weakened. Infrastructure decayed. The army that had enforced order, guarded roads, and secured frontiers was gone. And once the shield vanished, the blows came hard. The Picts pressed from the north. Irish raiders struck from the west. From the east came Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, not just raiders now, but settlers, conquerors, and future masters of the land. The Romanized Britons did fight back. They did not simply lie down and vanish. There were resistance leaders, war bands, local defenses, and memories of Roman organization still flickering in the dark. Later, legends may have transformed some of these defenders into the figure we know as Arthur, but legend cannot hide the larger truth. Without imperial structure, Britain was fighting a war it could no longer sustain. In only a few generations, the Latin-speaking, Romanized province of Britannia was fading away. The old order did not merely weaken, it was replaced. Part 12. And that is what makes this story so haunting. Rome did not just abandon a province. It abandoned a world it had spent centuries creating. Roads remained. Walls remained. Ruins remained. But the system that gave those things meaning had died. Britain became a land of fractured powers, local warlords, shattered towns, and incoming peoples who would reshape its language, culture, and future forever. The empire that once promised security had pulled away its hand at the exact moment danger closed in. So now the question comes to you. Did Rome make the only choice it could? Sacrificing Britain to save what remained of the Western Empire, or was abandoning Britannia one of the greatest strategic betrayals in imperial history? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you want more stories where empires rise, crack, and collapse under the weight of war. Make sure you like, subscribe, and stay with Battle Archive. Because the next fall of a great power might be even more brutal than this one.